Good afternoon. You have joined the webinar on revision 4 of the RAD notice, specifically dealing with Section 8 mod rehab and single room occupancy mod rehab. This is Will Levy with the Office of Recapitalization, and I'm joined here with John Ardavini, also with the Office of Recapitalization, which runs the RAD program. So just as background, there are two programs that are covered under this conversion option, where we allow mod rehab and SRO properties to convert to long-term Section 8 contracts. There's the traditional Section 8 mod rehab program, which has about 17,500 units remaining in the country. And there is the McKinney-Vento Section 8 mod rehab SRO program, which supports 13,000 units still today. These HAB contracts renew year to year with 12-month terms and at restricted contract levels, which has proven to inhibit access to financing. Through RAD, mod rehab, and SRO properties are able to convert to long-term Section 8 HAB contracts, which supports preservation through long-term subsidy commitments, often at higher rent levels, leverages public and private investment to address capital needs, and ensures that residents' right continues to benefit from the affordable housing. RAD is implemented through a notice. We've just published the 4th revision of the RAD notice. This is Housing Notice 2019-09 and PIH Notice 2019-23, also called RAD Notice Rev 4, which was published on September 5th. This supersedes all prior notices, including supplemental notices issued last year. It's broken into 4 sections. As you see, the Section 2 covers the conversion of mod rehab and SROs. For the other sections, we have conducted webinars dealing with public housing conversions and PRAC conversions, and in coming weeks, we'll hold webinars focused on resident rights across various conversion options in RAD. Some highlights of this notice. It aims to streamline conversion requirements for most mod rehab conversions, and especially for smaller properties. It implements a prohibition on any rescreening of residents upon conversion and fully describes residents' right of return. Creates an ability for mod rehab and SRO properties that are converting to PBRA, project-based rental assistance, to utilize contract rents based on the condition of the property following rehab. It provides an ability for owners of converting SRO properties, which serve the homeless, to establish a leasing or occupancy preference for families in ways that will facilitate permanent supportive housing. And it exempts most conversions that involve the preservation of the current site from using Davis-Bacon wages. With that, I'll turn to my colleague, John Ardavini, to walk us through the key program requirements and the changes that are enacted in this notice.
Good afternoon, everyone. When talking about eligibility for the mod rehab and SRO program, to be considered an eligible property, you have to have an active mod rehab SRO contract in good standing. As far as the physical condition, the property needs to show a passing HQS standards or housing quality standards inspections, or Uniform Physical Condition Standards known as UPCS. Now, if a property has a failing HQS or REACT score, they still may be able to pursue a RAD conversion. The RAD conversion would just need to address the scope of work, the failing issues covered in those reports. As far as eligible units, for conversions to PBRA, project-based rental assistance, all units on mod rehab or SRO contract are eligible to convert. For conversions to PVV, in most cases, all units on the mod rehab and SRO contract are now eligible to convert. What this means is those units on the contract that were occupied within the last 24 months would be able to be included in that PVV contract. Also, all households and units can be covered under the contract because rescreening is prohibited. Moving on to contract rent setting. For PBRA, rents are generally set at the lower of a rent comparability study, or 110% of the fair market rents. The RCS is a third-party report looking at rent comps in the area. For PBV, it's the PHA's rent reasonableness analysis, or 110% of fair market rent. Now, there are also exceptions that may raise the threshold above the 110% for both contract types. For instance, for PBRA, properties may use a small area zip code FMR instead of one set for the county or metro area. Also, properties in certain neighborhoods may be eligible to go up to 120% of fair market rents. And the thresholds for that test are one of three, and you just have to meet one of the three thresholds. If you have a rent burden households in your area, if your property rate meets a certain threshold, and if you have revitalization activities going on in your neighborhood or local area. Under PVD, there is also a chance to go up to 120% if the PHA is a moving to work agency and the neighborhood is what is called an opportunity area, or if the PHA can apply exception rents. As far as redetermination of rents, rents are redetermined annually by OCAF for PBRA and PVD in the same analysis. For details, you can refer to the RAD notice for redetermined rents. Another addition to Revision 4 was for PBRA conversions, owners may now request post-rehab rents with a rent comparability study. The rent comp study is going to break down both the as-is condition of the property as well as the post-rehab condition, and that would be reflected in the PBRA HAB contract. Moving along to the RAD conversion process steps. The first step is going to be your submission of interest. This is where the owner is going to provide basic property information to HUD through the RAD resource desk at www.radresource.net. What this will do is provide an opportunity to be assigned a HUD transaction manager, so you have somebody to talk through the concept of first successful RAD conversion. After the concept call is set up, the next steps prior to submission of your conversion plan are the following. You're required to notify residents with at least 2 resident meetings and address their comments in a 30-day comment period. You're required to consult with the local continuum of care known as the COC for SRO properties only. You're required to identify a public housing authority to administer the contract for project-based voucher conversions only. And you need to prepare your conversion plan documents for submission. Once you're ready and you've done all your related due diligence, you can submit your conversion plan. Generally, from submission of interest to submission of conversion plan, that process takes an owner 6 to 12 months. After the conversion plan, it's reviewed by recap staff, and an approval is usually issued within 60 days, and sometimes up to 120, depending on how well you put your package together. After RAD approval is issued, you can close on your financing if applicable. The mod rehab HAP contract or SRO contract is terminated, and you'll execute a new long-term project-based voucher or project-based rental assistance contract. Moving along to conversion plan submission, some of the major components we're going to cover in this webinar. One would be evidence of notification of residents and meetings, which you've already briefly touched on. Another will be a capital needs assessment, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Another is going to be a rent comparability study for project-based rental assistance conversions, which we've previously discussed. Financial commitments would be expected, whether it's equity, debt, or grants. You would also need to submit an operating pro forma or sources and uses, as well as an environmental review, which we'll also talk about a little later in this presentation. The capital needs assessment is going to be the most important piece for your RAD conversion for mod rehab and SRO properties. Generally, converting properties must demonstrate that immediate and long-term needs can be addressed as part of this conversion. And the form of evidence of the capital needs assessment is going to depend on your financing. For FHA insurance, the CNA, rehab scope, and replacement reserves are determined by the MAP guide. You'd be submitting a CNA in the form of a CNA e-tool. For LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits, whether they're 4% or 9%, the capital needs assessment, rehab scope are determined by the equity provider. HUD review of the CNA is not required as long as the annual deposits to the replacement reserve will equal at least $450. And your third bucket is conventional debt or no financing. You would need to provide a CNA performed by a qualified third-party professional, and the rehab scope and replacement reserves would be determined by HUD staff. Moving along to development requirements. Development sources and uses known as a budget or a pro forma. We're going to rely on FHA or equity investor for underwriting if that for proposed financing, development, budget, and pro forma in those cases. Otherwise, RECAP is going to do the underwriting. Concerning Davis-Bacon requirements, for conversions to both PBRA and PBV, rehab or construction performed on the existing site is not subject to Davis-Bacon wage rate requirements. Davis-Bacon would still apply to rehab or construction on the new site as part of transfer of assistance. Another major requirement is environmental reviews. For Part 50s, in the context of a RAD PBRA conversion, submissions must be made through the HUD Environmental Review online system known as HEROES. Radon testing is now required. For Part 50 reviews, you all should follow the MAP guide. For Part 58 reviews, unless the property has no rehab or responsible entity examined radon, the owner must submit a radon report. For conversions without any rehab, this is something new, and that are subject to Part 50, Revision 4 allows for something called a tiered review. HUD has made programmatic-wide compliance determinations for most of the applicable environmental laws and authorities and will complete a site-specific compliance review only for the following: coastal protection, flood insurance, floodplain management, and contamination. Which leads us to streamlined conversions for small properties. Revision 4 also creates a streamlined conversion option for mod rehab and SRO properties with 20 units or less. This means that you'll be exempt from the capital needs assessment, that you would not need to provide a development budget, and that you'd be subject to an environmental tiered review for PBRA. Some things you would need to do, though, in the context of a streamlined conversion is still comply with the resident notice requirements, provide a rent comp study for PBRA conversions, provide an operating pro forma to ensure that HUD staff can verify if you have debt service coverage, if that's adequate, as well as programmatic narrative and certification requirements. And now I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Will Levy.
Thanks, John. So another important change in Revision 4 is that it fully implements a prohibition against rescreening of any residence. So current households cannot be excluded from occupancy at the covered project, the project once it's converted to Section 8, based on any rescreening, income eligibility, or income targeting requirements that are standard for Section 8 admissions. Current households in the converting project will be grandfathered for application of any eligibility criteria to conditions that occurred prior to conversion, but would be subject to any ongoing eligibility requirements for actions that occur after conversion. This is what helps us to fully implement and require a resident right of return. We've always required a right of return, but in some cases that was not possible because we were not previously able to ensure that residents wouldn't be rescreened. But now that we can, the resident right of return is fully implemented. So all residents have a right to remain in or return to the property. No resident may be permanently and voluntarily displaced. If proposed plans preclude a resident from returning and the resident objects to the plans, the owner must alter the plans to accommodate the resident at the project. If there's any relocation, of course, the Uniform Relocation Act would apply. To maximize resident choice, owners may offer alternative housing options to residents, and residents can voluntarily decline their right to return by providing written consent, as long as that written consent is informed, so it's, again, in writing and with the proper counseling provided. It's voluntary. The resident can't be pressured and must be provided at least 30 days to make a decision. And it's well documented that the owner is retaining evidence of any notices, counseling, and of the resident's decision. The last thing to cover before we go to any questions from callers or those that have written them in is another key change in the notice. We've allowed for, created a route for a permanent supportive housing preference when SRO properties are converting under RAD. These SRO properties, of course, often serve households that are exiting homelessness and that are in need of deep supportive services, ideally through a permanent supportive housing model. Revision 4 outlines a route for owners to adopt a preference for households that qualify for services provided at the site, including disability-specific services. This would be particularly helpful when those services are Medicaid funded. For project-based voucher conversions, there's already guidance that PIH has put out in the Federal Register notice noted here that was based on authorization provided under HOTMA legislation in 2016. And for PBRA, the RAD notice provides greater detail on the criteria that must be met and how the determination is made for meeting the criteria. We encourage owners that are interested in this option to talk with us early to make sure you are going down the right path. And with that, we'll go to see if there have been any questions submitted or if callers have raised their hands to ask any questions. And I saw one question about whether or not we're going to make these slides available. As always, both the slides as well as this recorded webinar will be available both on the HUD website and on radresourcedesk.net. So you should see those up within a couple of days. Another question about whether there is further guidance on how we process the conversions. In fact, we are about to publish a processing guide for mod rehab conversions on the RAD resource desk. So also look out for that within the next few days.
Here's a question. So the question we got is the permanent supportive services optional?
So question whether owners are required to provide permanent supportive services. It is not a requirement. Of course, many owners serving this population are choosing to provide services and sometimes very deep services, but it is not a requirement of conversion.
Are there any RAD requirements or limitations when considering a reduction in the number of units? Conversion of SROs to efficiency units, would we need to provide displaced residents with an alternative housing option?
So the question is if you are reducing the number of units, which again we'll see this fairly typically if a property is all single room occupancy and they are converting to efficiency units so that there is a kitchen and bath in the unit, but of course that takes more square footage, so results in a reduction in the number of hard units at the property. So HUD, in those cases, HUD will provide vouchers that are not for any units that are not replaced under the project-based contract. You should work with your transaction manager to make sure that there is a reasonable and fair process that you work with your residents. It is still required, residents still have a right of return, and therefore you must, in order to reduce the units, enough residents would need to want to voluntarily accept an alternative housing option, which may include a tenant-based voucher, but you could not require that if all of the residents wanted to remain in place. We suggest you work with HUD if you're not already in touch with a transaction manager. Work with HUD on the specific details there.
So here's a question on the relocation log, and the questioner is saying, do you absolutely need the log to match rent rolls from the issuance of the CHAP date?
So I believe that's a public housing question, so if you could send that question in to us separately, we will respond to it. Thank you.
The elimination of Davis-Bacon applies to FHA loans for rehab?
If Davis-Bacon is triggered by some other financing source, Davis-Bacon would still be required. Thank you for the question. We should be more precise that the execution of the Section 8 contract is not a trigger for Davis-Bacon. But again, if you are using a financing source that requires the use of Davis-Bacon, which FHA insurance does, then Davis-Bacon would be required.
Can you repeat the change made to Part 58 environmental reviews?
For Part 58 environmental reviews, typically your responsible entity will review radon as part of their overall review. So we just want to make sure that that has happened. But in some places we're aware that's not part of their standard review, in which case we are asking you to submit a separate radon report to us as part of the financing plan. Okay, we're not seeing any more questions right now. We'll wait another minute or two.
Somebody typed they have another question, but they haven't typed it yet.
Okay, we were asked to repeat what we said about Davis-Bacon. So the change in the RAD notice is that the execution of a Section 8 contract is not a trigger for utilizing Davis-Bacon prevailing wages. It had been in prior notices. So the execution of a Section 8 contract is not itself a trigger unless you're executing a Section 8 contract at a new site. However, if as part of the conversion the property is utilizing some other financing or some other source that requires itself the use of Davis-Bacon prevailing wages, then Davis-Bacon would still apply. We are not overriding the requirements of any other program or funding source.
So are there any requirements regarding the change of unit type size? For instance, changing a one-bedroom unit to an efficiency or vice versa?
Are there any rules governing the change in the configuration of the units from one-bedrooms to efficiencies or SROs to efficiencies? There is not. We are fairly flexible to a wide variety of options. The primary concern is ensuring resident right of return. So the units must be configured in such a way that could satisfy the right of return requirements.
And then follow along with that, are there any appropriate unit sizing requirements based on household size?
Depending on whether the property is converting to PBRA or PBV, those programs have processes by which the owner or the housing authority determines the appropriate occupancy for different unit sizes.
So two questions on radon testing. The first one, when you're doing if you have 20 units or less, is radon testing required?
It is not. If under the streamlined option for properties of 20 units or less, the environmental review only includes for PBRA, it would be under a tiered review, and radon would not be covered would not be required by that review.
So just to clarify, on any tiered review, the radon test is not required?
Correct. Okay, well, that appears to be all the questions. We appreciate everybody's time. Again, if you'd like to re-listen to this broadcast, we'll have it up on our website within a few days. Thank you all for joining. We encourage you to join a webinar we are hosting in 2 weeks dealing with resident rights and engagement in the conversion of mod rehab as well as PRAC properties as they convert under RAD, which will be helpful information to make sure you are facilitating a healthy communication with residents and complying with all of our requirements on resident rights. Thank you all. Take care.